ask you to talk about something that's a very small part of your general intellectual and literary biography, but it's a number of comments you've made about literary theory and the use of literary theory and the abuse of literary theory. I started as a PhD, and so I was trained in all of that stuff. And I still teach a course on literary theory for creative writers. I'm in the creative writing department now, and that course focuses almost entirely on formalist stuff. So it's Bakhtin, the Russian formalists, Yuri Lotman, and those kinds of people, through Wayne Booth, and these kinds of attempts. So there's a form of literary theory which is really an attempt to do craft talk for non-practicing writers. Do you find any value in that stuff?
Very much. I wrote an essay on defamiliarization, and it was in some sense it was a practical essay for writers who are thinking about using what might be for them or for their readers familiar subjects that had to be tilted in some way, and I said you should be reading Shklovsky on defamiliarization and gave all the references to it. So yes, I use these writers. We were talking about Jameson earlier, who I think is essential reading, even if you don't follow the sorts of modes and the forms that he's interested in. I think he's still one of those figures you need to read.
I should say we're in the Bonaventure Hotel.
We are. And
a prime example is postmodernism.
Yeah, and if you're trying to think about what sort of a place this is, somebody like Jameson is very useful. I'll leave it at that.
What were we going to say?
I was going to say that, and we were talking earlier about a book reviewer here in Los Angeles, whom I got to know at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And when I was there as a graduate student in the PhD program, there was a kind of wonderful meshing of creative writing and theory. Al Cook, who had started that program, thought there really shouldn't be a separation into neighborhoods in which nobody was allowed if that person was from somewhere else. So creative writing classes were being taught by theorists. Some of the creative writing, or the people who had been hired as creative writers in that program, like Robert Creeley, wouldn't teach creative writing, they just taught literature classes. So I was trained to think there really shouldn't be walls between theory and actual creative writing.
That might have been the last moment in the last place that was true. I was at Iowa, and when I first got there in 1981, there was still a lot of interaction between the two programs, and that just got farther and farther apart.
Last week, I was sitting in my office at the University of Minnesota, and I was looking around for my copy of Wayne Booth's The Rhetoric of Fiction.
A great text for creative writers.
It's a great text for creative writers, and I started going up and down the hallways, going into the offices of my creative writing colleagues, saying, you don't happen to have a copy of Wayne Booth's Rhetoric of Fiction. No, they didn't have it. My academic colleague did. And then I found my own copy. But that was an important book to me when I was starting out. It's still important. It's still important. Those ideas haven't gone away. They shouldn't go away.
I find that my creative writing students are blown away by the idea of the implied author. I mean, just that simple idea is deeply important to them. To them thinking about layers of narration.
And there are a lot of concepts that are part of the usual parlance in creative writing classes that nobody really has thought through. the unreliable narrator, the implied author, what people are talking about when they use the term melodrama, what people are talking about when they use the word sentimentality or sentimental. They're just fixed ideas. They're like ideas in Flaubert's Dictionary of Received Ideas. Terms that people now use whose true meaning they haven't thought about seriously enough.
Which is what literary theory is for.
That's what it's for. That's what it's for. To clarify these ideas. When in my classes someone says, well, this is a pretty good story, but I think it's too melodramatic. I will say, okay, what do you mean by that? And in the workshops that I teach, it may mean simply that the writer has raised the stakes of the dramatic tension too high for this person's liking. And I say, but that's not what melodrama is. We need to have an understanding of what melodrama is if we're going to use that word in a class like this.
You know, I'm in a creative writing department,
Mm-hmm.
so for us the divorce is final and
Yeah.
settled, and
Yeah.
The children are dispersed, and
Yeah.
children are adults, and so that I'm not sure this is a good thing. That is, that the divorce is over, and the old relationship between creative writing as a kind of, somewhat suspect activity being done in a corner by a few people in the department, in the English department, has been replaced by an odd equivalence. I mean, the AWP, where we are
Yes.
at the moment, has almost as many people attending as the MLA.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe not quite,
Right.
but the balance has shifted in a
Yes.
remarkable way
Yes.
over the last decade.
Yes.
You want to speak to that at all?
What we need is a good sociologist to tell us why the separation that you're describing occurred in English departments, why creative writing broke off from conventional academic study, and why people who wanted to talk about writing, talk about recent authors, talk about topics that they felt were close to them in the MLA meetings came here. If anything, the AWP meetings now, these conventions are larger than Modern Language Association meetings. And I think one of the things that happened, whether it's true or not, was that in English departments there came to be a period, it wasn't very long, but a period in critical theory when the text, not a novel, not a poem, not a short story, the text was put under interrogation. And the critical idea was that the text would be under a kind of cloud of suspicion. And there still is a residue of that in many English departments, and the idea, I think, developed that if you really loved a novel, if you really loved a poem, if you really loved a short story, you might not find a teacher who also loved it unless you went into a creative writing class where these texts turned into poems again, or short stories again, or novels again. That is, I think, probably for the most part incorrectly, academic criticism began to be thought of as being hostile to literature itself.
I had a conversation with a student who had been at Iowa. I had written a piece on how to read books for Salon.
Yeah.
And I was talking about some of these theory versus literature battles in departments. And she said, I read your piece, and I just didn't I thought it was completely wrong. My professors at Iowa, the English professors, they all hated literature.
Yeah.
And I said, that's not true. And she named one of them. I called him, and he said, yeah, I hate literature.
Yeah.
He said, it's my job to hate literature. It's the hermeneutics of suspicion on the one hand,
Yes.
and also this sense that you're anti-democratic if you apply evaluative criteria to the text.
Right.
That once you make those kinds of evaluations, you are cutting out the mass of people who don't agree that Henry James is a great author, and therefore you're a bad person.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a kind of a democratic politics that abjures evaluation.
Right. I think some of it comes from a misreading of Derrida, a misreading of deconstruction, the way that some American critics turned deconstruction into what they called destruction, the destruction of a text. And also the phenomenon that you do discover if you spend enough time in English departments, that a good part of the faculty have just stopped reading in midlife. They don't like to read very much anymore. They're like the man or the person you described at Iowa who hates literature and feels as if he or she was tricked into a study of it from a youthful enthusiasm which he no longer has, and has the rage of someone who feels as if he'd been hornswoggled, and therefore just wants to express his rage against the texts that once enchanted him. You know, there is no greater curse than the idea that texts enchant us, and that the process of criticism should be that of disenchantment.
That it should be disenchantment.
There's a school of school of criticism that argues that literature is essentially a project meant to put something over on us. A series, as you know these arguments, a series of culturally created ideologies that are embedded in the poem, the novel. And it is our job as critics to see through all that. Once we've seen through it, however, where are we? You know, that's a great question.
You know, the criticism of criticism of criticism, the great Mencken essay on Spingarn and company. One of the lines in there that I've always loved is for a professor must have a theory, as a dog must have fleas. And so this is my theory, which is that there's always been a tension in American literature between a kind of democratic impulse, which says that what our job is, and it's easy to just see it in Whitman, for instance, our job is to encompass, is to include the multitudes that have not yet been included in the literary discourse. And so you think about the Harlem Renaissance, or the birth of Asian American literature, or this kind of constant attempt, or regionalism is what was the topic of my study for this, kind of constantly bringing people outside the literary compact into the fold. That's the project. And each new generation of literary commenters then come in and say, hey, I know who's not here yet. And therefore you're all very bad people because you've been excluding this group, right? And so that kind of inclusive impulse is at the center of American literature since the early 19th century in America. At the same time, of course, there is an evaluative project. You can't have a criticism without evaluation. I mean, it's part of, you can't have book reviews without evaluation. So the evaluative impulse and the democratic impulse are always in a little bit of, that's the animating tension that makes for the stuff of literary conversation in America. and you know, as I get older and start, and you know, we used to call it wisdom before we got here, which is this kind of like ability to stand back and say, oh, I see the arguments that you're having. I'm not necessarily interested in being on one side or the other of that argument. I'm interested in the fact that you're having it. I've seen versions of it before. Is that part of where you're sitting now, or do you still get exercised on one side or another of these kinds of debates?
I do. Let me put this in very practical terms. I think there is an idea that what goes on in writing workshops is that a story or a poem or a chapter from a novel is put in front of several readers. The readers read through it, and then it is the job of the workshop to say, and I'm just using received quotes here, what works and what doesn't. And I think that's one of the reasons that academic critics think that workshops are naive, ungrounded in any kind of true thought, and are just exercises in taste, if that. And when I began teaching these classes, I had never taken a writing workshop myself. I didn't quite know how it was done, but I knew that I wasn't going to sit in a room in which people debated each other about what they thought worked and what didn't. So one of the things that I said was, before we even begin to talk about how well we think this story is doing whatever it seems to want to do, we're going to have to describe it. And when we describe it, we're going to, and I just said, for the first 20 minutes, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about what we think this story is about, what formal procedures have been used in order to create those outcomes. We're going to talk about what form the story has taken, what we think the voice or the address, the rhetorical address of the story includes, and how the story goes about its business. Silence in the room. You really are going to make us do that? Yes, I am. And the first thing that happens, typically, after I've made those demands, is that one student or another student in the class starts in on a plot summary. And I say, that's not what I asked for. I asked you to tell me what the story was about and how that subject has been loaded on or fits into these forms that the story uses. The address, first person, third person close, second person, the verb tense, present tense, past tense. So in that sense, I'm a kind of formalist critic. And I'm teaching them a kind of practical application of formalist procedures. But without that, I don't think they're actually thinking about the way a piece of fiction is put together, and more importantly, how it can be altered to improve itself. Now, when you begin to talk about what the intentions of the piece might be, of course, you're falling into various kinds of intentional fallacies, but I think that's all right. I think it's okay, because then you're going into a kind of rhetorical criticism and saying, to whom is this addressed? What seems to be its intention in that address? And how does it go about making its claim as a narrative or as a lyric? I don't think I would be doing any of this unless I had read some of the people we've been talking about, Wayne Booth, even Jameson.
And Schlafsky.
And Schlafsky. And if I hadn't also had to spend years teaching composition. Because in composition, pedagogy, there's a very interesting writer named Peter Elbow who says, if you're going to teach composition, the first thing that you have to do in dealing with your students is to give back to them a version of what you think they've written. Because often they don't know what they have communicated. I also think that it's just an act of generosity to have read a story so well, so thoroughly, that you can give back to the author a version of what you think she has written, and to be able to cite page numbers and to say, on page 9 of your story, there's a character who we haven't seen since page 1, and who, all of these things, all of these things. And when I talk about this to some of my older colleagues, they say, oh, that's interesting. You're trying to revive close reading. Let me wipe the cobwebs off you. And my argument about that is that in some sense, theory undermined the new critics in a way they had to be undermined. But that if you're going to be a novelist or a short story writer, you had better learn the skills that the new critics had in close reading and finding patterns and knowing where everything was. Because without it, you are going to end up writing what I would call forgetful fiction. Fiction that doesn't remember what it put on page 1 when it gets to page 45. And fiction, if it's going to be, for me, interesting and well-made and thoughtful, is not going to forget where it's been when it gets up to page 45 or 245.
You know, one of the texts that I make the students read as well is Auerbach's Mimesis.
Of course, yeah. To the Lighthouse.
Yeah, those rhetorical readings, those philological rhetorical readings.
How do your students react to it?
It takes them a while to figure out why it's valuable, and then once they do, they get it.
Yeah.
So I make converts all the time with this class. It's actually quite easy, because all you have to do is give them a reason why they have to finish the book, and and they don't and not reject it out of hand. You know, just kind of come in and be able to articulate why they might want to reject it, and then they don't. There's something I would like you to do, which is to take some of what you just talked about and turn it on your own latest book. That is, when you talked about describing what a piece of fiction is about, you've given a certain clue to that by the way you titled each of the stories in that collection. Yeah. Are those clues reliable?
Not entirely. I ended up writing a decalogue after writing 2 or 3 stories that had the names of virtues in them. I didn't know what I was doing until I was actually doing it. William Maxwell used to say, you know so much that you don't know you know. I'm afraid this sounds like Rumsfeld when he was
a little bit.
when he was heading up the Defense Department, but for literary purposes it means that you can write without entirely knowing what you're doing until you're midway in the project. Now, I had been to a production in Minneapolis of Hamlet, and we've all read that play many times, and we've seen productions of it. This was a little bus and truck company doing Hamlet, really in a garage. And I noticed something I had never noticed about the play before, which is that the dramatic action of it begins with the appearance of the ghost of Hamlet's father making a request, which is close to a demand, given the fact that he's Hamlet's father. I want you to avenge my death. I want you to honor your mother, and I want you to remember me. And I thought that's very interesting. This play begins with a request moment. And there's a kind of hidden subtext to it, which is, do this in remembrance of me. Do these things if you love me. Then I saw a production of King Lear. King Lear gathers his daughters and says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to tell me how much you love me. And based on what you tell me, I'll divide up my kingdom. And I tried to think of a critic who would help me out on this, on the formation of a dramatic structure based on a request which had two parts. There's something I want you to do, and you'll do it if you blank, if you love me.
If you want your inheritance.
If you want your inheritance. And because I couldn't think offhand of a critic who had addressed this subject, I wrote a book of fiction in which I took that request and I put it through every possible permutation I could. And because I thought it had something to do with the moral lives that we do or we don't enact, I thought this is a kind of decalogue. I'll write a book of 5 virtues, 5 vices, and in every one of them I will embed a request moment. And I'll also put into each story what I think of as a one-way gate. A character performs an action, and having committed that action or having said that thing, he or she can't get back to the place where he was or she was before having done it. I think the writing of fiction, if you're trained in the way I was, is both very concrete. We're trying to bring into existence the rocks and the stones and the trees that make up our common life in a world of objects.
And the baseball bats.
And the baseball bats, all those things. But to the degree that there are patterns that we wish our stories to have in order for them to be coherent, we're also thinking about the way those patterns arise. And that, for me, is partly intuitive, and it's partly based on all of the ideas that I have encountered in my life and the consequence of the ideas. Gertrude Stein once said, the only thing that changes from generation to generation, do you know this? Yeah. The only thing that changes from generation to generation is what people are looking at. Mm-hmm. And that has been almost a watchword for me. I think unceasingly of what people are looking at and what has transfixed them. And as a result of what has transfixed them, I'm curious dramatically in what they are then wanting and asking others to do.
let's think this through a little bit more. I mean, obviously you have, but let me ask you two parts of that. I started to think there's a psychology that informs this general view that you have, and that psychology includes two different aspects. One is that what we is our patterns, right? Patterns of behavior, patterns of thought, ways of thinking. And the other is that that when the Stein statement is kind of funny because at some level we know that it's not just what we're looking at that changes. We actually change the way we think about things, right? Yeah. And so the denial of that fact is right is useful and interesting. Yes. But it's a denial of a fact as well, right? So I'd pick that up wherever you'd like.
We're sitting in a room in the Westin Hotel.
Yeah, Jerry, can you show what?
And when we look out the window and we see this landscape of Los Angeles, we're seeing, in the largest sense, cultural historical manifestations of what has gone into the making of this city. And I think that fiction writers and poets and novelists are in the business of, or partly in the business of asking themselves, when we look at this, what is the most interesting dimension to what is out there that is most telling? Is it the street people who are a few blocks away, who I think of not as, the poor and the crazy, I think of them as victims of capitalism. Are we thinking of those features of our lives that are now transfixing teenagers and people in their 20s? If we were to go down to the sidewalk, would we see people who are actually looking at the buildings and the trees, or are they looking at their iPhones as they walk down the sidewalk? It's, in a way, the business of fiction writers to pay attention to what people are paying attention to. And conversely, to what they're not paying attention to. In my classes, when the subject turns to dialogue, one of the things that I have been saying incessantly and in a somewhat tiresome way is that I think dialogue that reflects our time is dialogue in which people are listening selectively or carelessly or not listening at all. If we are entering a period of history in which distraction, understood in its largest sense, is a part of our lives, the fiction that we write has to reflect that as well. In French, the word that's related to distraction means madness. And I think because fiction itself, literature, is thought of as a distraction, we have to be onto ourselves and to be onto the way attention is directed and how attention creates or destroys patterns, to get back to where you started this question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, distraction and engagement are often exactly the same thing, just based on the perspective of the observer, right? Yes. That is, the person who is distracted from nature walking down the street is very absorbed in their in the social interaction that they're involved in on their phone, right? So that and when you're driven to distraction, when you're driven to madness, You're driven to attending to something that people don't think is important to attend to because it's not real or for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So the kind of it's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? Whether we're distracted or engaged in something else.
That's a great question, and I mean, I think that question is at the core of what literary critics, fiction writers are thinking about now. It's hard to look, just as an example, at the work of David Foster Wallace and not to think that one of his central concerns was what people are engaged in and what distracts them, and more particularly, what tends to fragment their consciousness. And this raises the question of whether there is such a thing as a well-made novel anymore, and whether the well-made novel, the novel that goes from here over there, is now a kind of Model T Ford of literature. I think he was nostalgic for that kind of writing. I think he couldn't write it himself. I think he felt that it was a sorrow for him that he couldn't do that, and that the kind of fiction that he really wrote, the stories in Oblivion, the way Infinite Jest is put together, is a kind of vast wonderland of fragments. To be invested in fragments is also to be engaged. These are the, to use an old new critical term, this is a paradox that never goes away.
And has been central to literary conversation since 1922.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
With Ulysses and one of my favorite linked story books, In Our Time.
Oh yes.
1925, right? Which is a series of fragments that somehow add up to something.
I taught In Our Time to a class of graduate students 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And they thought it was very radical. And
I think it's his best work.
Oh, I think so too. And it's, as you know, it's based on an earlier version of In Our Time that was even more radical than that book. And they were in a state of great excitement with the idea of a book of stories that has snapshot, italicized, glimpse stories related to trauma. And the old is always new again if you read it in the right way.
And of course, we managed to get through our entire earlier discussion of theory without using the word ideology. But one of the arguments against the well-made novel is that it's ideological, right? That kind of beginning, middle, and an end is too easy a framing for human experience. And one of the arguments of everyone from Joyce to Hemingway in those heady years was that we're going to represent reality in the David Foster Wallace sense of Infinite Jest. We're going to represent reality in the fragmentation, which is the way we in fact experience it and try to make sense of. And that's a reasonable goal for representation.
Yeah. The one part of the modernist project that we don't buy into anymore, although I still see manifestations of this now and then, is that there was in modernism and the period just before that the idea that with the death of God and the death of the church, the sacred was going to be moved into the realm of art. And art was going to be a kind of spiritual project, and in Joyce and Eliot, and not Pound so much. Myth, well, yes, and Pound too. Myth was going to be used as a way of bringing the sacred into the work. I don't think anybody believes that anymore.
I'm surprised to hear you say that. I mean, one of the ways people talk about your work is exactly. I mean, I'm thinking of Michelle Hunnivan's review of this book in the New York Times.
I've had a lifelong struggle with these ideas. I've, in my earlier novels, First Light and Shadow Play, even the titles tell you that there's going to be some kind of religious debate going on. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time reading Kierkegaard, but I finally felt that that was a struggle that I was losing. And that it feels like a rearguard action to me. And it's idiosyncratic with me.
And so, but you're still engaged in it, are you not?
I can't help it. I can't help but be engaged in it, any more than Michelle Hunnivan can be engaged in that very same project.
Yes.
Which is
Deeply.
Why I'm a great admirer of her work and feel that she's writing wonderful and deeply serious fiction about what it's like to be alive in our time. In our time. What's interesting about Hemingway's book and the title is that it suggests that what's more important in fiction is not where you are, it's when you are. That In Our Time is a book about what it's like to be alive now. It can be Upper Michigan, it can be Italy, it can be Weinsberg, but what defines it is that it's happening now. And I think he gets that, again, from Gertrude Stein, who would like to talk about the excitingness of contemporaneousness and to catch what it is in a particular period. Not a particular place, but in a period.
Mm. One of my favorite literary essays of all time is The Making of Americans.
Oh, yes.
Where part of the joke there, because I do think she's just the funniest writer in the American canon.
Yeah, she's hilarious.
Right?
She's hilarious. And one of the things that she says in that essay, The Making of Americans, is that she had noticed that people after World War I were not interested in the action of World War I. She said action is now of no interest to anybody. She said what people are interested in are the soldiers after the war standing around on street corners. And she says that Joyce, very grudgingly, she says, Joyce and Proust and I myself are writing fiction in which nothing happens. Which is not quite true. It's not quite true. But she's on to something. She's on to what became a major feature of art in the 20th century. Slow art and stasis, music which was repetitive, the kind of art in which you could say, this isn't going anywhere. And I love it all the same.
You know, it makes me think, in There's Something I Want You to Do,
Mm-hmm.
I was very regularly surprised at big things happening.
Yeah.
I seemed to be in a story in which I was looking at the minutia of the way people were interacting with each other, the kind of their own inner struggles, and then something happens.
Yeah.
Somebody gets hit by a streetcar. Somebody gets whacked in the legs or somebody whacks somebody in the legs with a baseball bat. These are big, eruptive events.
if you grew up in the way I did and spent a lot of time reading, let's say, Henry James when you were in your 20s, you come to think that fiction is all about sensibility. And as I've gotten older, I think, well, that's part of it. But our lives are often disrupted by action, and I have to remember that now and then people are walking through parks and are mugged by desperate people who are wielding baseball bats. And I've been thinking a lot about this because I live in Minneapolis. Minneapolis has a large Somali community. We have a thing called the Mall of America, which is the #1 North American Al-Qaeda target. Minneapolis is the #1 North American ISIS and Al-Qaeda recruiting locale. We can't pretend that all of the conflict that is going to be part of fiction is the conflict between the protagonist and the environment. Conflicts also exist between individuals. And in my workshops and elsewhere, I keep going back to this question, where is the antagonist in this story? And I think it's part of a sort of bourgeois ideology to say the antagonist is me, or the antagonist is this awful apartment I live in, and not to say there are actual people out there who wish you harm.
And what's next?
I'm working on a novel called The Mall of America. I'm a few chapters in. It's the old story. I don't know how to write it. I don't know how to do what I want to do. I just try to put one foot in front of another.